Okay, so thank you very much. I think the mic is working, maybe a little bit too well. So if for whatever reason the mic drops out or you can't hear me, especially if you're in the back, just let me know. And thanks also to the speakers or to the organizers and also to the other speakers for the invitation to be here. It's sort of very exciting. And we're happy to have a chance to get some feedback on this work. It's fairly new, so we're curious to hear what you think. So like Frank said, this is joint with Daryl Rowbottom, who was supposed to be here, but unfortunately couldn't. He sends his regrets. He's a philosopher here in Hong Kong. And also with Johnny Lee. Johnny Lee is an astrophysicist currently working in Belgium at KU Leuven, used to work at CUHK, though. So sort of based in Hong Kong, at least one way or another. So this is a philosophy of science paper. It's on scientific discovery, and in particular, it's an attempt to start to think about the kinds of challenges that are raised for scientific discovery and closely related notions, challenges raised by sort of uses of AI in science that have emerged really just in the last couple of years in a big way, at least amongst certain scientific quarters. So this work is part of a broader project. It's called the Philosophy of Contemporary and Future Science, and we've got two main sort of organizing questions. One set of questions is methodological, so we're interested in, how are AI tools, but in particular, deep learning models, those are the sort of big interesting innovation these days. How are deep learning models being integrated into scientific practice? How might they do or might they supplement or increasingly in some cases supplant more traditional kinds of scientific methods, tools, or techniques or practices? So that's one cluster of questions, and I'm going to say a fair bit about those questions later on today in the context of a couple of cases. And then the second cluster of questions are more epistemological. Here we want to know or given their sort of expected methodological role, what sorts of scientific achievements, things like prediction, explanation, understanding, discovery, and so forth, might these promote or perhaps in some cases undermine? Now, obviously, these are just sort of a small sample of the kinds of philosophical questions that we might ask about the role of deep learning models and AI more generally in science. And we shouldn't necessarily expect uniform answers. It's going to come down to sort of the details of the case, things like the kind of learning system that you have in question. Is it supervised, semi-supervised, unsupervised, kind of reinforcement learning perhaps, and the specifics of the application. Presumably, these are both things that will make a difference. What we're going to look at today are a couple cases drawn from suitably broad, suitably different parts of science to try to get a sense of sort of the different considerations that arise in different cases. And these questions are obviously intertwined as well. Most notably, your answer to the methodological questions is going to bear on your answers to the epistemological questions. So like I said, what I want to focus on are attempts to use deep learning models to, or in the context of scientific discovery. This is something that has received a tremendous amount of attention. Sort of throughout the 20th, sort of AI for scientific discovery has been received quite a bit of attention throughout the 20th century, but deep learning in particular, the scientific community is really coming around to thinking that it might be a real driver and accelerator of discovery. Okay, now, like I said, there is a long tradition of investigating uses of AI and machine learning in particular for scientific discovery. This work dates back more or less to the emergence of AI as a discipline in the mid-20th century, pursued most vigorously by figures like Herbert Simon. That was in the 70s through sort of the mid-90s and early aughts. So if you come anywhere close to the discovery literature, you may have come across this collection, Scientific Discovery, Pat Langley, Herbert Simon, and others. In effect, reporting on their attempts to develop a variety of tools for making discoveries in an automated way. For example, things like the ideal gas law, Kepler's law, and others, they were able to design programs, typically expert systems, the Bacon programs, most notably, to at least show as a kind of proof of concept that you can automate certain parts of the discovery process. This work was in some respects limited. Like I said, methodologically, the main tool that they had at their disposal were expert systems. So that was one potential limitation. These tools weren't especially strong, although they got pretty far with them. But there are also some sort of what we might think of now as rather undermotivated adequacy criteria on the project. Simon, for instance, took it to be an adequacy criterion that whatever kinds of discovery procedures we find, they should be the sort that could, at least in principle, be carried out by actual human investigators. They are the sorts of things that maybe even scientists in the past actually used to carry out various discoveries. So it was partly a project in cognitive psychology. That emphasis has more or less fallen off the radar these days, as we'll see. So these days, however, lots of interest in AI-driven discovery in particular is driven by interest in using deep learning models for discovery. So there are a variety of recent collections trying to get a grip on the variety of applications throughout science. Here are two recent ones, and then there are reflections as well on things like large language models and much more. One of the more sort of optimistic goals of this research is to fully automate the discovery process. So from hypothesis generation to running experiments, to collecting data, to analyzing data, to coming up with new hypotheses on the basis of that data. The goal here is that we could, in principle at least, come up with what is in some quarters called closed loop scientific discovery. So fully automated, or at least nearly fully automated science. There's a couple sort of main motivations for this work. Some motivations are merely practical. If you can design an AI system to run your experiments, collect your data, do your data analysis, if you design these systems well, your data collection will be more reliable, less prone to error and bias that might creep in. And those seem like good things to have if we can have them. So there's sort of obvious practical advantages to carrying out this kind of project. A slightly more, there's another sort of motivation too, though, which is that, suitably designed AI tools might accelerate and enable the discovery of phenomena or hypotheses which are in some sense novel, which wouldn't be epistemically accessible otherwise. And so the hope here is not just that we can, do more reliable, more bias-free science, but in a way but also that we might get, to do the kind of science that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. That's at least sort of the pitch. That's the hype. What we are sort of interested in doing in this paper is just trying to start to get a sense of the different kinds of applications, the different kinds of contributions that AI can make to science, with an eye to trying to, ultimately down the road, assess these more optimistic or more ambitious claims about what AI might do for discovery. And I mean, so like I said, we've got a scientist on our team. Our audience is partly scientists here. Daryl and I are both philosophers, and so we're interested in philosophical issues. But one thing we're sort of hoping to do with this project, although it's still in its very early stages, is find a way for philosophers to contribute to debates that are already happening among scientists in a way that's profitable and hopefully helps make some positive impact on the way that science goes, because there's a lot of money pouring into AI and science right now. Okay. So I guess two big questions. So first, what are the prospects for AI and particularly deep learning driven discovery of novel scientific phenomena or hypotheses? Phenomena is novel, just as we'll understand it very roughly, if it's unanticipated or unexpected, given sort of the current theoretical frameworks that we happen to have. Serendipitous discovery is an obvious example here as well. So that's one question. And then given these prospects, how should we invest our limited scientific resources? So in the background here is sort of observation that in frontier scientific domains of the sort that AI tools are frequently deployed in, there are pretty substantial opportunity costs associated with pursuing one or another kind of technology. And it's a non-trivial question to, of what option you ought to pursue. As we'll see later on, one of our examples has to do with gravitational wave astrophysics. And as we'll see there, the investments of time and energy into a particular kind of technology are potentially on the order of, decades. So, you want to make at least a reasonably well-informed choice early on, especially because once you make a choice, in particular, if, for example, you decide to pursue an AI-driven technology, there might be no going back. And so there are potential costs associated there. Okay, so that's just a bit by way of motivation or background to what we're up to. What about philosophy of science and discovery? I mean, I think discovery has had a somewhat fraught place in philosophy of science. So for the people who haven't sort of got the background in philosophy of science or haven't come across this before, this is what's known as the context distinction. This was championed by Reichenbach and Popper, and its effect was basically to kill any philosophical interest in discovery per se for a good chunk of the 20th century. So the thing here is that we should distinguish between two sorts of questions we might ask about a discovery. One, how is a scientific hypothesis generated, conceived, or invented? On the face of it, this is a question of like, how do scientists come up with their ideas? Perhaps it's a question in cognitive psychology, perhaps about the sociology of science, how research groups come together to generate hypotheses. And so that's one sort of question that we can ask. And the other sort of question is, well, if you give me a hypothesis, under what conditions should we accept or reject it, or maybe just remain agnostic with respect to it? So that's a question about like post hoc evaluation or assessment. The distinction isn't a causal one. It's not a temporal distinction. It's rather a distinction in the kinds of questions we can ask. In practice, answers to both of these questions are pretty thoroughly intertwined. So these are sort of a philosopher's invention to try to get a grip on what's going on in discovery contexts. In any event, one consequence of this, like I said, was that this distinction was that it basically killed any philosophical interest, not entirely, but for a good chunk of the 20th century, philosophical theorizing about discovery per se. Most of the action, it was thought, occurred in the context of justification. It is sort of striking more recent reflections on the role of deep learning in scientific discovery I don't want to say uncritically, this is a paper by Eamon Douaid, but have perhaps not as carefully as they ought to have taken this distinction on board as well. So the question here is something like, how should we understand the role of deep learning models in scientific discovery, given that these systems are often epistemically opaque? Epistemically opaque in the sense that there are significant open questions about their particular operations, how they come to, say, compute a given function. So what Douaid argues is that, look, if we think about the role of deep learning models in scientific discovery, bearing in mind the context distinction, then there's nothing especially new or interesting going on here. As he puts it, in many cases, the fact that these models are opaque is just epistemically irrelevant to attempts to justify claims arrived at with these tools. So in effect, Douaid is saying, look, we've got two sorts of questions we might ask. You could tell a sort of maybe cognitive psychological or sociological story about, you could sort of describe how these tools have promoted discovery in certain kinds of contexts. There's not much philosophical action there. Where there might be philosophical action is on the side of justification. How should we think about the justification of, say, the outputs of a deep learning model given that these things are opaque. So here's kind of a picture of the way that Dwayne is thinking of things. We've got the context of discovery. We can do lots of interesting science, and we'll see some examples in a moment. We can do lots of interesting science, trying to evaluate, propose, and refine various hypotheses. And then given those, as an output of the process, then we can ask, well, what justifies them? What grounds do we have for accepting or rejecting one of these hypotheses? So I think this is sort of, this is a well-known distinction. It's very natural to take it and apply it to contemporary uses of deep learning in science. And I think it's sort of fine as a first pass. But I also think it's slightly more useful when we think about discovery, deep learning for discovery in science, to work with a slightly more complicated framework. So a couple of reasons you might be dissatisfied with this picture of things. It looks like, so Dwayne says, look, one of the most striking features of these systems is that they are extremely epistemically opaque. But at least as far as scientific discovery is concerned, we can sort of, set that aside. It's at least epistemically irrelevant. It's not the sort of thing that can be subject to, let's say, evaluation in some sense. And that's not obviously clear. Sometimes knowing how the system works does tell us something important, and we'll see an example in a minute, does tell us something important about how we should use those outputs in pursuit of other scientific ends. So that's one sort of concern. And then the second, this way of thinking about AI and science, it sort of overlooks, I think, one of the more important ways that these tools are used. Again, I'll sort of show you some examples to illustrate this later on. But just that the way that these tools are used is really to help orient researchers towards hypotheses which might prove to be useful, fruitful, interesting down the road. So all that's to say, we need to use a little bit of terminology introduced by Larry Loudon in the 70s. We should also think about what's Loudon calls the context of pursuit. So here there's sort of three questions we can ask about a scientific, about discovery processes. So how are hypotheses generated? Given some batch of hypotheses that are generated, which ones ought we to pursue or develop? And then there's the question of which of these should be accepted or not. Okay, so that's a little bit of sort of initial background by way of motivation and philosophical maneuvering. But what I want to do next is look at a couple of cases in a little bit more detail. So the first case is AlphaFold 2. I think this is one of the most striking successes of deep learning in science certainly in the last 5 years or so. And so I'll start with just a little bit of background on AlphaFold 2, if you haven't come across it before. So an extremely important problem in structural biology is determining the 3D sort of conformation, the 3D fold of a given amino acid sequence. If you can do that, if you can predict that 3D structure, you can determine all sorts of important things about how that protein will interact with drugs. You can use it to determine drug interactions. This can be useful for discovering new kinds of drugs, and also just understanding a wide variety of biochemical processes. Now, the problem is that given an unfolded protein chain, there are just an absolutely extraordinary number of possible folds, at least, that it could in principle take. Something on the order of, greater than 3 to 100 for an a sequence of 100 amino acids. So this is computationally hard, and there are sort of technical problems you can define here. They alternate computationally hard in a very precise sense. They're either NP complete or NP hard. So the question is, can we go from an unfolded amino acid sequence to or determine, at least with high probability, the folded structure from the amino acid sequence, at least in a wide variety of cases. So that's the problem. The breakthrough, and so, well, let me say this. Work on the protein or on the structure prediction problem is organized, at least within the structural biology community, around these biennial competitions called CASP. And in effect, what you do if you want to compete in CASP is you have your structure prediction system, you submit it, and it's tested against a batch of experimentally solved proteins, but which aren't revealed to you in the course of building your system. And there are various metrics that are used to compare the goodness of the outputs of your system with against the experimentally determined structures. And so AlphaFold debuted at CASP 14 in 2020, and it blew the competition out of the water by a pretty wide margin. It was the first AI system to achieve near atomic level accuracy for at least sort of the backbone protein structure, sort of the main structure in the fold, but with also high accuracy for side chain folds as well. So the little bits that are off of the side. So here's just an example. So green is the experimental result, and then blue is the computational prediction by AlphaFold. It might look like there is not a significant amount of overlap, but these are pretty good. These are, at least using the proprietary score that's been developed by the structural biology community, both above sort of 90% matches. So just to give you a sense of like how close of a match these are, we're talking about less than 2 angstroms or so on average of distance between the AlphaFold prediction and the actual, or at least the experimentally determined structure. And it was really quite a striking, quite a striking result too. So AlphaFold was trained only on single chain amino acid sequences, so just one sequence at a time. It turned out that if you just fussed with the input encoding a little bit, you could get it to generate very good predictions for multi-chain amino acid sequences as well. So multiple sequences in a row that then fold together, form even more complicated structures. And that's really striking because you've got a remarkable ability to generalize in the system based only on seeing a certain sort of pretty narrowly circumscribed set of data. So how does it do it? So here's a high-level view of AlphaFold's architecture. You give it an input sequence, some deep learning magic happens, and it spits out a 3D structure with high and low confidence levels for various parts of the fold. Now it's doing a few different things here, or at least looking at 2 different kinds of information. So one thing it's doing is it's comparing inputs against a database of solved structures. And this is a pretty common technique within these structural biology, within these automated structure prediction systems. The thought is that, look, if you can find something that looks very similar to your input sequence, and then look at the fold that's produced by that's something that's very similar, then that gives you at least a template that you can work off of, and then you can spend some time to refine that template. And that's where a lot of the innovation in AlphaFold actually was involved, was in this sort of very fine tuning. And to do that, it used information about evolutionarily related parts of sequences. Here, in effect, the idea is that you can, so when a protein folds, you start with a string and then it clumps up into some complicated thing. And what you want to know is which parts of the sequence, which in the unfolded state might be very far apart, which ones are going to be close together when they fold. If you can know something about that, that would tell you how what the final structure should look like. Now, what AlphaFold was able to do, or what its designers did, was use a modified version of attention. That's the kind of mechanism that's driving something like ChatGPT. And that allowed them to identify correlations between parts of the amino acid sequence which are otherwise very far apart. That's one of the big drivers of its success. So it's like ChatGPT, but but for proteins. So here's a little video of what goes on. So you give it, and this is published by the DeepMind team that came up with AlphaFold. So you give it a amino acid sequence, and it iteratively refines the 3D structure until it eventually arrives at a fairly stable final conformation, and the different colors indicate different confidence levels. Okay. So what accounts for success in this case, and what sorts of discoveries can we get from something like AlphaFold? The first thing to note is that protein folding is an especially nice application case for a couple different reasons. It's no accident that DeepMind chose to focus on the structure prediction problem as opposed to another one. So, I mean, first, the problem itself is highly amenable to treatment by a kind of deep learning system. It's a reasonably clear-cut problem that you can define fairly straightforward loss functions for. The kind of problem that deep learning tools are especially well suited to solve. You have some error function that gives you the distance between an experimentally solved fold and that captures sort of the difference between an experimentally solved fold and your predicted fold. And then the goal is just to bring them into alignment as close as possible. So the problem itself is amenable to treatment in these terms. And we have sort of well-defined metrics for calculating how good or how bad a given prediction is when compared to an experimentally defined fold. So that's one reason. Second, there's a wealth of domain-specific information that can be used to tune proprietary loss functions for the different parts of AlphaFold here. So there's a whole lot of structure in these two deep learning blocks. And if you go sort of check out this paper and look at the supplementary information, you can get sort of a very detailed look at what's going on there. But there's, a dozen different sort of sub-loss functions that are defined for this problem, designed specifically to generate good folds. So one example of this is that we know that tertiary structure, that is the 3D folded structure, must respect certain geometrical constraints like the triangle inequality. And so you can come up with a loss function that forces AlphaFold at a certain stage to respect the triangle inequality. So that's the second thing. And then the third sort of reason that this problem is so amenable to treatment in these terms is that the database of known structures is essentially complete, and structural biologists have known this since the early aughts, more or less. What this means is that for any given input sequence, there's going to be some template that's already been solved experimentally that's going to be a pretty good match. So really the problem to be solved was just one of fine-tuning the kinds of fine-tuning the matches that you found in the template library. So the real question that AlphaFold was solving really, wasn't how does this thing fold? It was rather how do we find a good match, and how do we fine-tune once we've got the match? That's what AlphaFold was doing. So, all of this means that the solution space, as far as these things go, was reasonably well understood. Structural biologists had a pretty good idea of the kinds of folds to expect. They know when things look weird or wonky, and they're able to finely tune their design, sort of engineer AlphaFold in a way that got the results that, in effect, they knew they should be looking for. So what kinds of discoveries does AlphaFold give us? Does it give us novel discoveries? I mean, in one sense, it's giving us novel information about how certain kinds of sequences fold. It's not giving us new types of fold. We basically had all of those already. Maybe it's giving us novel properties of certain fine-tuned novel folding properties. But in effect, what we've got here is a fine-tuning problem, and AlphaFold turned out to be very good at that. How am I doing for time, by the way? Okay, how much do I have left? Okay, good. Okay, so what does AlphaFold get us? Well, a boost in precision, that's for sure. But maybe the most important thing is that it allows us to circumvent what are otherwise very expensive experimental methods. And this kind of should come as no surprise. So the main experimental method you can use to determine, or at least the main experimental method that's used by structural biologists to determine 3D fold is X-ray crystallography. So here you embed a protein in crystal, determine a diffraction pattern, and then eventually through a sort of rather complicated process, you come up with an atomic model, and that gives you your fold. Why do I say complicated process? Well, going from crystal to fold is the kind of thing that you could do for maybe 6 to 8 proteins, and that would get you like a PhD, and would take you a few years of work. So there are absolutely significant investments of time and energy that are involved with extant experimental techniques. And what AlphaFold lets us do is circumvent those. So it plays a labor-saving role. Now, in the language that I introduced earlier on in the talk, I think the way to understand this is that, look, what it does is it just shows us, or at least increases the pursuit worthiness of a certain kind of hypothesis. So when you're considering whether to pursue a given hypothesis, in this case, the hypotheses are three-dimensional folds. These are predictions that are generated by AlphaFold. There are various opportunity costs involved. Do you want to spend 6 to 8 months trying to experimentally determine the structure when you could be doing other scientifically valuable things? What AlphaFold gets you is at least a very good first approximation. And in fact, that's the way it has been used by scientists subsequently. If you've got a really tricky protein that you're not sure how to solve, plug the sequence into AlphaFold, it'll narrow down your range of possibility. And rather than spending 6 months to try to find the fold, it'll maybe take you 2 weeks. And that seems like a benefit. So the opportunity costs associated with doing the experimental work are a lot lower. So there is a kind of evaluation that you can undertake with AlphaFold outputs here. And I think that means that opacity is at least somewhat relevant. So AlphaFold is extremely opaque. We don't understand how it generates the folds that it does. We have a general sense of how it was trained, and that was useful. And that's sort of useful at a very high level. But if AlphaFold has learned, say, principles of protein folding, we don't know what they are. Now, if we did, that could potentially be useful, because if we knew how it was generating a particular fold, that would tell us whether the fold that it generates is the kind of thing that or at least give us more information about whether it's the kind of thing we ought to spend some time sort of dedicating our experimental time on or not. If we knew that it was using well-motivated, sort of physically well-motivated principles to generate this fold, then maybe yes, it would be worthwhile to spend our time on it. If not, if it's just using sort of some heuristic rule of thumb, at least for a protein of a certain kind, then perhaps it's not worth taking it quite as seriously, despite the gains that it gives us. Now, there is a little bit of work in the scientific field of explainable AI that tries to reverse engineer what AlphaFold has learned, tries to reduce AlphaFold's opacity. And this is probably the foremost attempt that we've come across. So here's how it works. Remember, the AlphaFold generates this iteratively refined structural prediction. Now, question, is it learning or is it using principles of folding dynamics to generate predictions or not? And so what this team did was they, in effect, looked at proteins for which we do know, at least roughly, their folding dynamics, and compared those to the intermediate predictions generated by AlphaFold, and compared them to see if they lined up. And the upshot is that basically they didn't. They concluded that their results demonstrated state-of-the-art protein structure prediction methods like AlphaFold, but they considered other ones too, don't enhance our understanding of the principles underpinning folding. Now, this I think is sort of philosophically interesting. They're working with a very particular sense of what the principles underpinning folding might be. In effect, that the principles underpinning folding are principles of folding dynamics. But there might be other kinds of principles as well. Perhaps sort of useful mid-level generalizations about how certain classes of proteins fold, even if those don't capture folding dynamics. So I wanted to mention this because it seems like this is the kind of place where there's potentially room for philosophers to make a useful contribution. Think about the kinds of assumptions, in particular philosophical assumptions, that are being made here in the interpretation of a particular XAI technology for a scientific use of AI. Okay, so I've got a little, well, let me skip this. I can come back to this in Q&A if folks are interested. In effect, there's sort of interesting questions about what we should do when AlphaFold's predictions are just as good as the experimental predictions, and in some cases, AlphaFold does better than experimental results. There are potentially interesting questions about how we should think about what our justifications say for accepting a given fold should be in those cases. But I want to make sure I get to the second case as well. So AlphaFold is like a success case. It looks pretty good. What do we get from it? Well, we get discoveries of novel properties at the very least, but we're not necessarily getting novel kinds of folds. And how does it help us sort of when we're doing science? Well, it helps by narrowing down the range of options you have to consider when you're doing the experimental work. And this can increase the pursuit worthiness of a given fold. Okay, so that's sort of like the two main points. The second case, things are a bit gloomier. So we've been thinking through this. This is primarily, we're interested in this case because one of our co-authors, Johnny Lee, is a gravitational wave astrophysicist. So this is a case that's near and dear to his heart. And it's an interesting one to think about, one, because the theoretical situation is much different than what we have in structural biology. Much more is unknown in this case. But also AI tools are only at the sort of beginning to be developed for doing discovery in gravitational wave astrophysics. And so it's a nice case for, again, sort of philosophers or potentially philosophically minded scientists to perhaps make some interventions in the direction of the scientific research too. So let's see if I can give you an intro to gravitational wave astrophysics in less than 5 minutes. So what are gravitational waves? Basic thought is that when you have accelerating non-uniform masses moving very large things moving very fast, they will radiate gravitational energy and cause fluctuations in the structure of space-time. These were predicted by Einstein, and there was a tremendous effort throughout the 20th century to come up with tools, instruments that could detect them. The first direct detection was achieved only in 2015 after a significant amount of effort. So here's a little video just to give you a sense of what's going on here. So the kinds of, we've known for about 50 years that the kinds of extragalactic events that are going to produce detectable gravitational waves are going to be extremely violent, on the order of 2 black holes smashing together. So you've got 2 very massive objects moving very quickly. And when they, as you saw here, spiral around each other and then eventually smash into each other, they radiate gravitational energy in the form of what are known as gravitational waves. So the waves there are exaggerated. By the time, so this would be an event that happened, millions of years ago, very far away. By the time these waves reach Earth, and they do, they are extremely subtle, on the order of sort of local perturbation in space-time produced by these are on the order of 1/1000th the width of a proton. So, astronomically small. And so we have to design tools that are able to detect these. The main way we do it now are with these very large laser interferometers. So the way this thing is set up, when a gravitational wave passes, it's going to do two things. It's going to stretch space-time this way first and this way second. And so you can set up two parallel lasers in such a way that when the gravitational wave hits them, it stretches the laser, well, first one way and then the other way. That causes or produces an interference pattern on a photodetector, and you can work backwards from that to figure out the waveform, that produced. So why do I mention this? Well, it's to give you a sense of the epistemic situation that is confronting us in gravitational wave astrophysics. These measurements are extremely subtle, and even very loud signals are absolutely dominated by noise. This is what's known, at least amongst gravitational wave astrophysicists, as a noise-dominated measurement regime. Now, there are lots of techniques that you can use to minimize the amount of noise. In these cases, you have to watch out for things like trucks on the road. If you detect a truck on the road as you're making a measurement, that data is corrupted. You can't use it. They're sensitive enough that they'll pick up an airplane flying overhead. They'll pick up, earthquakes. So you have to compensate for all these things. And even given that, the signals of interest are typically very, very deep in the noise. So what you need to do is carry out targeted searches in your detector outputs to identify waves. And the way you do this is with a technique called template-based search. So the basic idea here is you take your preferred theory of gravity, these days that would be general relativity. You consider a type of event, like a black hole merger. You fix certain parameters for that type of event, so say the masses of the black holes, and then you predict the kind of signal that will be produced by an event of that sort. You create a whole bunch of these predictions, you put them in a bank, and then you just compare those to your detector output, and you look for matches. So, and you do this using very large-scale numerical simulations of general relativity. So that's what is going on in this middle pane here. Up top, we've got the actual output from the first detection that happened in 2015. That's what the output of the detectors look like. In the middle here, the red is the simulated signal. And so here you can see the signal's pretty loud, and so you've got a fairly good match. That tells you that you've got a gravitational wave on your hands. And it tells you something about the kinds of events that produced it too, because you know exactly what parameters were set to generate that template. So the takeaway from this is, how do we do discovery in gravitational wave astrophysics? Well, you kind of have to know ahead of time exactly what you're looking for. There are about 100 detections to date, mostly binary black hole mergers, but there have been a few detections of other kinds of mergers, some neutron star mergers, and then some cases where you have a star and a black hole which smash together. Okay. So that's sort of the quick and dirty gravitational wave astrophysics background. Let me say something about how deep learning is expected to fit into the picture. So increasingly, deep learning tools are being used to try to expedite this process. The reason is that coming up with simulations to come up with these templates, as they're called, and then comparing them against output is extraordinarily time and labor intensive. So in a way, it's similar in that sense to the AlphaFold situation. Making quick detections of these waves is important because depending on the type of event it is, you might need to tell your friends who work in, say, electromagnetic astronomy to point your telescope over there, and you might see something interesting happening. So fast detection is a virtue in this area. And deep learning tools are thought to be, are sort of expected in some quarters useful for this. So here is a sort of prospective, sort of proof of concept study that was done to try to develop a convolutional neural network for detecting gravitational waves. So here you've got your detector output stream, and then your CNN, which if you set it up right and train it well, will, given the output stream, just indicate where it thinks the gravitational wave is, and then you can go investigate further. Now, how do we train these things up? Well, you train them on template banks. You train them on the kinds of things that we use in the ordinary case, in the non-deep learning case. So you take a bunch of these template banks, you train a convolutional neural network on it. The way that this is sometimes talked about is that you produce sort of an abstract representation of this template bank, capture it in the CNN, and then that's going to do your detections for you. And there's some sort of promising initial results here. At least we've been able to, well, the community has been able to rediscover some events that have been detected by more traditional means using real life data. These haven't been used in production though, so it sort of remains to be seen whether or not we will get any new detection from them though. Okay, so here's a concern. Are there gravitational waves that we might be overlooking? This is a significant ongoing concern within the gravitational wave community. There are two sort of sources of concern about this. One, we know that GR has to be wrong. And so there might be signals which deviate from GR in subtle ways, which we might just be looking or treating them as if they were noise because we don't have the right sort of theory of gravity to use. Second concern, there might be unexpected or maybe even unconceived kinds of events out there that we don't know that we should be looking for. They could be the kinds of events that if we were able to pick them up, we would potentially make some fairly significant scientific breakthroughs. That's sort of the hope in the community. So you might wonder, well, couldn't we just train up a neural network to look for these other kinds of events? I mean, it's not immediately obvious how. And I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll keep it pretty quick. So one, there's sort of conceptual challenges. The space of alternatives to GR is potentially very large. And the space of alternative types of events, alternatives to black hole mergers, is potentially large as well. So there's sort of a theoretical problem of developing models for these alternatives. And then there's a technical problem, taking those and computerizing them. This itself is a significant area of work. It's something that Paul Humphreys, for instance, makes a big deal about when he's writing about simulations. Even if you have sort of a well-developed theory, it's a whole other problem to take that and put it into a form that's tractable in a way that we can come up with simulations for it. So it's not immediately obvious that we can just train up CNNs to look for new kinds of events that we didn't know that we ought to be looking for in the first place. And I think it's also important to bear in mind at this point that we're working in a context where scientific resources are limited, and there isn't necessarily an easy way to go back. So if we devote a significant amount of our scientific resources to these neural networks, or to sort of AI-driven discovery methods in gravitational wave astrophysics more generally, we might be in a position where we are missing out certain kinds of events if we've made incorrect assumptions about the kinds of templates we ought to be using for these AI systems. Sort of maybe a deeper problem here. The question is, can we identify an anomalous signal? Not just can we identify anomalous signals though, but can we identify them as like anomalous signals as opposed to merely bits of noise? And that's a very hard problem. And this isn't unique to sort of gravitational wave astrophysics. Unexpected signals might violate our expectations in ways that are themselves unexpected and hard to anticipate. And it's hard to see, or at least at any rate, it seems unlikely that this can be automated for the time being. So, good news for physicists, they still have work for now. Okay, so that was a lot of science. What are the upshots, at least provisionally? If we're thinking about AI and discovery science, I think the right way to think about it is in terms of sort of the language of pursuit worthiness, and thinking about the ways that AI systems can contribute to the pursuit worthiness or not of a given hypothesis. So, that view I started with at the beginning that says, like, look, there are these two attitudes you might take. There's sort of the discovery question. There's the justification question, the acceptance question. And there's sort of nothing special or new about AI in either case. I think sort of the interesting action going forward is going to be in this middle ground, thinking about whether AI systems introduce new considerations about whether a hypothesis is pursuit worthy. So that's one takeaway. Second takeaway, the striking success cases, at least so far, involve pretty tightly constrained problem spaces in very well understood scientific contexts. So what does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean, I mean, we're not saying that you shouldn't develop AI models for other kinds of contexts. But it does mean that you shouldn't throw AI at a problem just because you can. And there certainly is a temptation in some quarters to do that. In effect, AI is no panacea. Prospects for novel discoveries, this is the example of gravitational wave astrophysics, are a little gloomier when the search space is large, amorphous, and largely unknown. Yet this is frequently the case in frontier science. So in that sort of case, we would recommend at least some caution with the use of these tools. Okay, that's all we got. Thank you.